Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one, the main advances happened in the Donetsk region, where the Russians focused around the Toretsk city area. The Russians also made an advance in the direction of Kumar within the southern parts of the town, advancing through Fedorivka and across the river line. Starting out in the south, the Russian advance through Fedorivka into Kumar from across the river line now allows Russians to have two separate supply routes into the town. The Russians also have secured the western flank of Fedorivka with the capture of the town, leaving only a few Ukrainian possibilities of counterattacks, mainly centered around the southwestern flank through the fortified positions. From the western road from Voskresenka, from the very western flank, through the road is a wide distance that can be targeted by Russian FPV drones, making it a difficult road to launch a counterattack from and to resupply their forces from. Instead, the fortified positions allow for infantry to move through the first lines and into Fedorivka, where the Russians have the fortified positions to secure their western flank. So based on this, we see that the Russians have a solid supply line towards Fedorivka. It can be struck by Ukrainian FPV drones, but their Ukrainian positions are again practically very far from the front line, which allows for Russian quick advances from Fedorivka towards Kumar. We're fighting now with the central parts and eastern parts under Russian control. The Russians have a solid foothold within the town. With the fighting over the fortified positions, securing it will likely allow the Russians to gain full control over Kumar fairly quickly, as the Ukrainian positions are significantly weakening as the days go by. In the Toretsk direction, where the main developments of this update take place, the Russians have managed to secure the northern parts of the city completely, leaving only the northwestern and western parts remaining under Ukrainian control on the outskirts. At the same time, the Russians managed to gain control over fortified positions close to the Kryvyi Toretsk river, and the main supply route for the Ukrainian forces to this entire area here west of Toretsk. The Russians also managed to advance to the east of Delivka, where they are flanking fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal west of Kurdyomivka and Zelenopilya. Starting out in the northern parts of the city, the Russians have managed to gain control of the waste heaps in the northern parts of it. This allows the Russians to completely clear the Ukrainian positions within the city, and now the fighting will be taking place over the gray zone north of the city for the Russians to secure the roads into the industrial zone and the residential area here in the western parts of the city that encompasses the fortified positions and the first patch area, which are the main areas which the Ukrainians still hold control of within the city itself. The Russians are here attempting to pincer the Ukrainian positions by attacking them from the north and from the south. The Russian objective is to gain control over the final residential area and move through the fortified positions from both flanks to pincer the Ukrainian forces and gain control over the outskirts of the city, which will enable the Russian forces to move on to their next operation, and that is to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces operating here within the towns of Sherbinivka, Novospassky, Katerinivka, and Klebenbyk. This entire area here, located west of Toretsk, is in grave danger of a Russian operational encirclement. There are two main roads that lead into this pocket for the Ukrainians, which they are using to supply their forces. There's the railway and road connected from Ivanopilya in the north down towards the towns in the south. Then there is the main highway here to the west of the reservoir going through Yablonivka, which then has a road connecting to Katerinivka and Klebenbyk. The Russians have reached the outskirts of the town of Alexandro-Kelenova here south of the highway. If the Russians are able to gain control of it, which is located on the eastern bank of the river line, and cut off this road either physically or by gaining fire control of it, the Russians will be able to significantly limit the supplies going towards these towns. At the same time, with the advances by the Russians here along the fortified positions along the highway here east of the Kryvyi Toretsk river, the Russians will be able to gain control over the highway connecting to the north from the south, and at the same time they'll be able to gain fire control over the railway area and the final roads connecting the north and the south. Based on this, we can see that the Russians will be able to gain fire control over both roads, which are the only roads that lead into these areas and that can supply the Ukrainian forces. We can see that it is a vast area, a lot of residential areas within Novospassky, Sherebenivka, Kartsurenivka, and Klebenbyk, as well as the area leading up to Ivanopilya and Leshivka. Therefore, the Russian push here in the north puts the Ukrainians in a very critical position and marks the endgame of the Battle of Toretsk. By operationally encircling this entire area, the Ukrainians will be weakened and the Russians will gain control over a vast area west to the city, fully securing the city and its surroundings, allowing for future offensive operations towards the north in the direction of Ivanopilya, north of Delivka towards Oleksandru Shultine, and to connect their forces between Toretsk and Chesev Yar. The Russian control of and capture of the fortified positions here east of this road was located with this footage here, and taking a look at the footage itself, we can see the Russian forces fighting up against the Ukrainian fortified positions, striking the Ukrainian fortified positions with FPV drones as they are looking to target the infantry defending these positions as the Russians slowly move up through the fortifications to gain control of them themselves. The Russians are mainly using infantry to push up against the Ukrainian positions. With the cover of FPV drones and artillery, they don't meet much resistance. This footage here shows the continuous Ukrainian control over the industrial area to the southwest of these fortified positions, which is the next target of the Russian forces. The Russians need to gain control over this industrial area to have fire control over the road and to secure the southern flank of the fortified positions along the road itself. Having additional supply roads will allow the Russians to have a stronger foothold and control over the positions that will enable them to have fire control over the road further north. It will also allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions from the rear, gain control over the industrial area. It will allow the Russians to make use of that as an outpost for operations down south to gain control of the fortified positions, to allow the Russians to have the control over the eastern flank of these towns, settlements, and the encircled area. It will also allow the Russians to have a direct supply line through Toretsk all the way towards the operational encirclement. To the east of Delivka, the Russians managed to advance to gain control over some fortified positions and reach the Naumykhe River. The Russians are looking to gain control over the southern bank of the river line connecting to Kordyomivka. This will allow the Russians to have a secure foothold over the Oserianivka road that leads towards Delivka. Getting control over the eastern road will allow the Russians to have additional supply routes towards the town and expand the zone of control around it. The Russians are looking to gain control over the general area on the northern flank of Krymsky and Toretsk, again to further secure the northern flank for the operational encirclement of these positions. The Russians are looking to have this operational encirclement as the do or die for the complete capture of Toretsk and the surrounding areas. For them to have a secure operational encirclement, they need to have a buffer zone that includes these fortified positions north of Delivka to sustain Ukrainian counterattacks. In the western direction, in the direction of Oleksandru Kalinove, the situation is much easier for the Russians to hold on to, as the Ukrainians would have to cross over a river line to counteract the Russian advances. The Russians' objective is to gain control over Oleksandru Kalinove, and that will stabilize their control over the western supply road. In terms of Ukrainian counterattacks from the Katerinivka or Klebenbyk directions, these are much more possible. However, they would have to travel a fair distance against Russian positions that will be expanding in this direction and flanking them from that direction. Instead, their focus will be to be defensive operations to withstand against Russian operations to gain control over the high ground and the fortified positions overlooking the towns along the railway and the Krivitorets River. And this is really the story of how a Ukrainian counterattack to prevent the Russians from gaining full control over Toretsk and expanding their zone of control around the city turned into a trap that the Russians made use of to attack the flanks. Now that the Ukrainians were dedicating their forces towards the city itself, the Russians realized that with the limited manpower of the Ukrainians, they would not be able to defend everywhere, and now that they are concentrating their forces in a counterattack, they'll be able to attack the flanks, and they made full use of that to attack the flanks of Toretsk, gaining control over several fortified positions to the north of Toretsk, and to significantly expand the zone of control here to the west of New York, getting control over a vast area, and now enabling this operational encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces ended up launching a multi-month long, approximately 5 months long operation to counterattack in the direction of Toretsk, and all it managed to do was buy time for the Russians to attack the flanks and operationally encircle their positions, while they were constantly counterattacking against a city where the Russians had the cover of the urban area. With use of FPV drones, they would be able to constantly strike the Ukrainian supply lines and to strike any of their footholds that they are attempting to gain before they entrench themselves, leading to increased casualties for the Ukrainians storming a city, and then culminating in an operational encirclement that will take place over the next few weeks towards the end of the month, where the Russians will look to gain full control over the southern bank of the reservoir and to enable for the Russian operational encirclement of the city of Kostiantynivka. In the end, the Ukrainians created for themselves an additional Bakhmut meat grinder ahead of the new one, which the Russians are creating for the Ukrainians, which is Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk further west. The siege of both of these cities will require immense Ukrainian manpower, and in such scenarios, the Russians will be able to launch additional offensive operations on the flanks of these cities, where the Russians will be looking to not just operationally encircle these cities, but also to expand their offensive operations towards the other regions, such as Zaporizhia region, and in the direction of the Uskar River line, where the Russians look to gain control over both banks of the river line. Not to mention the consistent Russian advances within the Sumy region in the northern section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.